So we're going to talk about lady beetles, ladybugs, ladybirds, whatever you want to call them. Talk about some of the different species that we have here in Illinois, some of the benefits that they provide us, as well as things we can do in our landscapes to help promote their populations. So first off, lady beetle superstitions. So there's a lot of superstitions that go around lady beetles. A lot of people think they're good luck. They land on you. That's good luck. Bringing good weather. There's a lot of poems, maybe more from the kind of the medieval time, talking about ladybirds, bringing good weather, or asking ladybirds to bring good weather to farmers and stuff like that. In Germany, they thought that lady beetles would foretell if there's going to be a good harvest. So if they found a lady beetle that had more than 7 spots, grain would be scarce. If there were fewer than 7 spots, there would be an abundant harvest. So again, a lot of that superstition and mythology around them. In Northern Europe, finding a husband. So if a lady beetle were to land on a young girl, and it would crawl around on her hand, it'd be supposedly measuring the size of her wedding gloves, and then whenever it would fly off, the direction it flew off in would be where her future husband would come from. So those are some of the superstitions. There are also some people who believe that they could be a cure for measles, colic, toothache. So for toothaches, they would be ground up and then mashed into the hollow tooth area, which sounds kind of disgusting, but that was at one point I believe that could help with toothaches. So we also have other poems that go with lady beetles. So ladybird, fly away home. Your house is on fire. Your children's at home. All but one that lives under the stone. Fly thee home, ladybird, ere it be gone. And this poem comes from again, this is several hundred years old. And hops plants. So hops, plants used to be burned to help control aphids and lady beetles. A lot of lady beetles will feed on aphids. So when those hops were burned and kill off their food source, and would kill a lot of lady beetles too. So farmers would recite this before they would light their hops on fire, kind of as a warning to let the ladybirds know that they need to leave, that they're going to start burning their homes and their food source. So ladybirds have been kind of woven into at least European and kind of United States and North America mythology and superstitions and stuff for a long time. So ladybug, ladybird, lady beetle, a lot of different names for these as well. So Our Lady's bird or the lady beetle. So this comes from England. This used to refer to the 7-spot lady beetle. This is because the Virgin Mary was often depicted wearing a red cloak in early paintings. And this beetle has 7 spots, and those 7 spots are supposed to symbolize the 7 joys and 7 sorrows of Mary. So Our Lady's bird, that's where it came from. That was, eventually that came to be the common name for all lady beetles, not just that specific species. In other countries as well, a lot of those names are associated with Mary. Here in the United States, ladybug kind of became the common name, preferred term over time. So these are not actually bugs or obviously birds, but they're actually beetles. And then the Coleopterus, that's the order for beetles. But bugs are in Hemiptera or Heteropterus. They're a completely different group of insects. So with beetles, on the left there, you can see our lady beetle. Their wings, the top wings, the elytra. So those are the front pair of wings. Those have been hardened off into a shell. They meet in a straight line down the back. So that is the kind of the defining characteristic of beetles. So you can see that arrow pointing to the back of that lady beetle. You can see we have that nice straight line. Beetles are also going to have chewing mouth parts, whereas our bugs, they have these beak-like or these straw-like mouth parts. You can see that on the top picture, the arrow. That is their mouth. So they're using their mouths to puncture their prey or plants and suck out the juices of whatever they're feeding on. Their wings are also different. So their front pair of wings, the part closest to the body is kind of leathery, and the tips are going to be membranous. So a couple different ways you can distinguish ladybugs and lady beetles. So technically, we should probably be calling them lady beetles instead of ladybugs. And I mentioned for lady beetles, so again, on the left there, that front pair of wings is formed into a hard shell or the elytra. Their hind wings, the ones that they fly with, they're still membranous. Those will fold up underneath that that elytra. So it's kind of a little bit like origami. They'll fold them up and store those underneath those elytra, which will protect those membranous hind wings. So lady beetles, a little more on those. So these are family Coccinellidae, and the Coccinellidae comes from coccineus, which means scarlet in Latin. A lot of lady beetles are red in color. So that's how they got that family name. So in general, they're going to be round or oval shaped, kind of domed, but and almost flat on the bottom, like you can see on this picture here. When you're looking down on them from the top, the pronotum, kind of part of the thorax, pretty much always completely conceals the head from above. So you can't actually see the head of the beetle in a lot of cases when you're looking straight down. Similar to cockroaches, they have that large pronotum that you can't necessarily see the head when you look straight down. Again, those are the elytra, or those wing covers. Again, here we can see that pronotum, again, covering up that head pretty well on this individual here. Their antenna, they have very short antenna, 8 to 11 segments. Unless you have a microscope or a really powerful hand lens, you're probably not going to be looking at on any of this stuff. And you can see at the tips of those antennae, we have 3 to 6 segments. They form a little bit of a club. And then the tarsi, so these are the segments kind of the foot, the tarsal formula. So the front legs, the middle pair of legs, and the back legs is 4, 4, 4. It appears to be 3, 3, 3. Unless you're keying out beetles, you don't need to worry about this. This will probably be the last you ever see it. But if you really wanted to identify, key out a lady beetle, these are the different characteristics you would be looking at. So the eggs of lady beetles are usually elongate, kind of football shape or elliptic. In a lot of cases, sometimes they can be a little more circular, but usually kind of that football shaped type egg. Oftentimes they're going to be bright yellow, like in this picture here, but we can also have some different colors. Some of them will be transparent, light gray, orangish, just kind of depends on the species. But for the most part, they'll be yellow in color. Most of them are also going to be laid in groups. Again, like this picture here, you see these clusters of eggs. There are a few species that will lay them singly as well. And again, oftentimes they're laid upright. So they're facing up and they're kind of glued, quote unquote, glued to whatever they're laying those eggs on. Typically leaves is what those eggs are going to be laid on. And some species will secrete kind of an oily substance, and that's going to contain defensive chemicals that are going to make those eggs distasteful, so they are not eaten. Not all species will do this, but some of them will do that to help protect their eggs. And oftentimes those eggs are going to be laid by the food source. A lot of times aphids. If you have a big aphid colony, you look closely, you may see lady beetle eggs being that have been laid, or you may find beetles laying eggs within that colony. Eventually those eggs will hatch, and then the larvae will come out, and they're kind of elongated, almost alligator-like. So you can see in this picture here, a lot of times they're going to be dark, and they have these colorful markings and quote unquote spines, or these projections coming out, oftentimes from the abdomen, which you can see them on the thorax as well. And they go through 4 instars. So the egg is going to hatch. You're going to have the first instar. It will feed some, molt, and then you have the second instar, and then so on and so forth. So insects, in order to grow larger, they have to molt in order to get bigger. So they'll do this 4 times before they will pupate. And typically they're going to pupate on the plants that they're developing on. So if they're feeding, in this case, this is a milkweed plant. This beetle right here, more than likely, eventually pupated on this plant that it was spent basically its entire larval life on. So how many lady beetle species are out there? It's about 6,000 species worldwide that have been described by scientists. We have about 500 species in America, north of Mexico. Couldn't find an exact number for Illinois, but there are 81 species in Iowa. So we're probably, probably similar number here in Illinois. So we see, the ones we're really familiar with, but there's quite a bit of diversity in lady beetles here in the Midwest. So what do they eat? For the most part, they're going to be predators. So these are going to be beneficial insects. They will primarily feed on small, soft-bodied insects, so aphids, like this picture here. So this is, again, milkweed. We have a lady beetle feeding on those oleander aphids. This is one reason why if you get on a bunch of aphids on milkweed or on plants, a lot of times you don't need to do anything about it. Their natural enemies like lady beetles are going to move in. There are some that will feed on scale or mealybugs, some feed on mites, some will feed on eggs of insects and things like that. There are a few species that feed on fungus or like powdery mildew, things like that. And there are also a few species that can be pests. So generally, we think of them as beneficial, but there are a couple species that can damage plants and could potentially warrant control if populations get high enough. So some of the lady beetles we have here in Illinois. So the convergent lady beetle. This is one of the most common lady beetles we have here in North America. And they're going to feed on a wide variety of different types of insects. So again, all the ones we listed on the previous slide, aphids, mealybugs, things like that. Again, these small, soft-bodied insects that they'll feed on. They'll also feed on pollen and nectar if the insect populations are low, but they do need to feed on aphids, or they do need to feed on insects if they're going to lay eggs. So they're not going to lay eggs if all they have is pollen and nectar. They need those animals, those insects to feed on if we're going to have egg laying. This is one that if you're buying lady beetles online, or if you live in an area where they sell, you can find them at garden centers. A lot of times, this is going to be the species that you'd be purchasing. And in the Western US, they overwinter in mountain valleys, and people will then go out and collect those and sell them. So again, they're typically harvested while overwintering. So this top picture here, this is a picture of an overwintering population. So again, this is in California in early spring. So people will go out, collect those. Typically, they'll hold them in a refrigerator, or they'll keep them cool so they stay kind of while they're still hibernating. When they start emerging or start waking up and dispersing from their overwintering, when they do this, typically they will disperse before they start feeding and laying eggs. So when people are going out and collecting these and selling these insects have not done that natural dispersal, that natural migratory behavior, and they have, this is kind of obligatory. They have to go through this for whatever reason. They do this before they start feeding, laying eggs. So if you're buying these lady beetles and releasing them in your landscape, their biology is to disperse before they start feeding and egg laying. So if you're buying these, they're typically not going to stick around in your landscape. They're going to disperse before they start feeding and stuff. So while you certainly can buy lady beetles to distribute, a lot of times it's not very practical in outdoor settings because they will disperse throughout the environment, and you're not going to have very many sticking around in your landscape more than likely. Now, if you're in a more controlled environment, greenhouse setting, that's a little bit different because you can contain them. But outside, maybe not the best use of your money. Another species we have here in Illinois is the pink spotted lady beetle. This is one I see, at least in my yard. It's probably the most common one that I see. So this is a little bit different looking than some of our other lady beetles. It's a little more oval, elongate, and the head is much more noticeable on this species. And they're also reddish to bright pink. I think they're very pretty lady beetles. For these, the pronotum has two black triangular spots. You can kind of see that on that top picture there, and then 6 spots on each of the elytra. And they feed on a wide variety of small soft-bodied insects, aphids, mites, insect eggs, small larvae of other types of insects, and they will also supplement their diet with plant pollen. So early in the year, I see them a lot on dandelions. That top picture is strawberry flower from my garden. I found this individual feeding on the pollen as well. So they will feed on pollen until those insect populations get large enough, and then they will move to insects. And there's been some studies that have looked at these. Plant pollen can constitute up to 50% of their diet. So when we talk about creating habitat, flowers is going to be important. So we'll keep that in mind. We'll come back to that. And they're also going to overwinter in large groups in protected sites. So I found these in brush piles on logs on the ground. You flip them over, you'll have large congregations of them underneath tree bark. That's the picture on the bottom right there. I had a dead tree, pulled off some bark, and had probably 50, 60 lady beetles underneath that bark. So again, providing overwintering areas is going to be important, not only for this lady beetle, but other ones as well. We have the parentheses lady beetle and the polished lady beetle. So the parentheses lady beetle, they have kind of these parentheses on the elytra on the back side there. You can see that on the picture on the left. Sometimes that parentheses isn't complete, so that's that inset picture there. But that's um, how they get their name, because they have this parentheses type shape on their elytra. Polished lady beetle, red to orange wing covers, and does not have any spots. And you can see they have these lobes on that pronotum, on that thorax area, which is be how you could identify these. Both of these will feed on again aphids, other small soft-bodied insects, and these are smaller, both less than a quarter inch in length as adults. We have the two spotted lady beetle here on the left. So again, that bigger picture, typically they're red, and they have one black spot on each of the elytra. But like a lot of other insects, there can be a lot of variation in that. So again, that inset picture, sometimes they can be black with red spots. So typically going to be that red with black spots, though. We also have the 9-spotted lady beetle there on the left. So 4 spots on each of those elytra, and then one central spot as well. And again, these are feeding on small soft-bodied insects, found in a variety of different habitats, meadows, fields, forested areas as well. We have twice stabbed lady beetle here. So these are black with red spots on them. So kind of like they got stabbed on each side of the elytra with those red spots. These are pretty small insects, about 3/16 of an inch or 5 millimeters, for those of you that are fans of the metric system. They feed on scale aphids and mealybugs, and they tend to live in trees. So we see these a lot more in trees. And when I think of these more as more scale and mealybugs, but they will also feed on aphids. So one that you're not necessarily going to see maybe in more of a, depending on how many trees you have, may not see this as much in a typical suburban landscape where we don't have a lot of tree cover. But if you have a lot of trees, this may be one you see fairly frequently. Our 20-spotted lady beetles. This is one of those that feeds on fungus. This one feeds on powdery mildew, and there has been some investigations being done as to see if this could be used as a biocontrol agent for powdery mildew, particularly in greenhouses. Again, in a greenhouse, you can keep them contained. They're not going to disperse throughout the environment. For these, they're going to be white to light tan. Now, the pronotum typically is going to have 4 dark spots on it, but you can see this one has 5. So again, not set in stone. And then you usually have 9 spots on each of the elytra. So, and then I did mention we do have some that will feed on plants. So we do have a couple that can be pest species. So we have the squash beetle or squash lady beetle and the Mexican bean beetle. So on the left there we have the squash beetle. So again, we have this typical lady beetle shape, the dome. Kind of circular shape. These are quite a bit bigger than what we typically see for lady beetles. They can be almost half an inch in length, and they're going to feed on plants or on cucurbit plants, so squash, cucumbers, other things like that. And you can see on the inset picture that's the larvae, so it's yellow and has these black projections out of them. And when they feed, you can kind of see this in the picture. They'll cut this circle in the leaves, and that kind of stops the sap flow. And then they will feed within that. You got to get the skeletonizing damage to it. Same thing with the adults. Typically, populations don't get high enough to really warrant control, but on occasion they can get high enough where you may need to do something about them. Probably spray an insecticide to control them. Mexican bean beetle, same thing. Only they're feeding on beans and other legumes here. They're going to be a little bit smaller. They're about a quarter inch in size. They're more of a darker orange coppery color, whereas the squash beetle is more of a yellowish orange. But the same thing, kind of get that skeletonizing damage on plants as well. So not all lady beetles are necessarily good in our landscapes. We also have the 7-spotted lady beetles. This is native to Europe and Asia, and this was introduced into the United States and North America in the 1950s. Probably the most common lady beetle in Europe. It is larger than most of our our native species, and it's going to be red with 7 spots. Um, and because it is a little bit bigger, there is the potential for it to potentially outcompete some of our native species as well. And we have everybody's favorite, the multicolored Asian lady beetle. So this is the one that gets into your house in the fall. So this is native to Eastern Asia. So from Siberia, Kazakhstan area into Russia, through the Himalayas, into Korea, Mongolia, China, over into Japan, is where this species is native to. Beginning in 1916, the USDA started releasing these, or not necessarily USDA, but they were being released as potential biological control agents um, to manage aphids. But all these times, this happened numerous times: 1916, 1964, 1965 in California, other places around the country in the 70s and 80s. But each time they did this, they failed to establish. So despite everybody, all these releases, they didn't get established until at some point in 1988. There were some that were captured around the New Orleans area, and it is believed these were came in accidentally on some sort of shipment, and for whatever reason, uh, this population was able to establish and is now spread through a lot of the eastern United States and even into the western parts of the country. So again, these are slightly larger than our native species. The reason they're called multicolored is because they are extremely variable in appearance. They can range from kind of a yellowish orange to red to black. You can have anywhere from 0 to 22 spots on individuals. Um, One way that people commonly will identify these is if you look at the pronotum area, you can kind of see an M-shaped pattern on the pronotum on many of these individuals here. So that's one way you could potentially identify them. You can see down on the bottom right, some of these color variations do not have that M, but that is one potential way you could identify these. But they are also larger than our native species. Again, they're feeding on aphids and other soft-bodied insects. Um, but they do outcompete our native species in a lot of places as well. So, like I mentioned, these are the ones that get into your house or your place of business during the fall, and they're coming in to overwinter. In a lot of areas, they're overwinter in rock faces and stuff like that, and we don't have a whole lot of those in much of Illinois. So, your house is the next best thing. Usually, kind of the southern or western exposure, we have a lot of sun and it's warm. They'll make their way into your house and overwinter. While they're indoors, they're not reproducing, they're not mating, they're just there overwintering. And then when it warms up again in the spring, they will go back out into the environment. I have heard of people having allergic reactions to them, so that could be cause some issues for some individuals. They can be a pest in wine, so when they get into the grapes and those are harvested and processed into wine, um, they can have some off flavors in that wine. It does not take very many beetles for that to happen, so they can be a pest species. And these are often blamed for decline of a lot of our native species as well. So those are, again, we have a lot more species than that, but those are some of the more commonly encountered ones we have here in Illinois. So lady beetles, while they are predators, there are other things that will feed on them. So the picture top left there, this is a robber fly that is mimicking a bumblebee, but it has captured this lady beetle and is feeding on it. The picture on the bottom left there, you can see the cocoon that lady beetle is sitting on top of. This is actually a parasitoid wasp. The parasitoid wasp will lay an egg inside of that lady beetle. The larvae will hatch and will feed on that lady beetle, and eventually it will emerge out of that lady beetle and spin a cocoon, and it will kind of turn that lady beetle, quote unquote, into a zombie. And that lady beetle will sit over that wasp cocoon and protect that cocoon until that wasp hatches. At which point, about 25% of lady beetles that this happens to will then go off after this happens and go about their way. But if you get close to that that pupa, that cocoon, and it'll start waving and try to protect that cocoon. So they've kind of taken over that lady beetle, at least temporarily, to protect them, because that pupa and that cocoon is vulnerable to attack. So that lady beetle is protecting it. On the bottom right there, this is a fungus that infects lady beetles. Most commonly see it quite a bit. Again, the multicolored Asian lady beetle. It's probably the one most people see most often, but it will attack other species of lady beetles as well. And this is um, it's kind of referred to as an STD for lady beetles. So it is transmitted when lady beetles come into contact with one another, and it is feeding on the hemolymph or the blood of the insects. It typically does not kill them, but you can see we've got all these fungal structures coming out of the beetles. When lady beetles are disturbed or bothered, they will do something called reflex bleeding. So they will have force out their hemolymph or their blood from their joints or other parts of their body, and they've got some alkaloid toxins in these that make them distasteful. So that when they are attacked, hopefully the attacker will leave them alone. So the top picture there, that is actually a lady beetle feeding on lady beetle larvae. This happens quite a bit. Lady beetles can be cannibalistic and they will eat other species as well. They don't really discriminate between what we want them to eat as our pest insects and other lady beetles and stuff like that. But like I mentioned, this is distasteful and also smells bad. So that's one of the reasons why those multicolored Asian lady beetles, if you're collecting them, trying to get rid of them, that bad smell that is coming from those chemicals in their hemolymph and potentially that reflex bleeding. They just have multicolored Asian lady beetles have much higher concentrations of those alkaloids than our native species do, which is why they smell a lot worse. At least to me, they smell worse than our native ones. So populations declines. This has been probably not in the news as much as bees and monarch butterflies, but we have been seeing population declines in lady beetles for several years now. The nine-spotted lady beetle was once the most commonly found lady beetle in the northeastern United States. Now it is rarely found. There's been some places it hasn't been seen since the 1990s. And a lot of places we're seeing populations go from almost all native species, and we're starting to see more and more of these introduced multicolored Asian lady beetle, seven-spot lady beetle, things like that. Some places, native populations have decreased 68%. But there is some evidence that populations may have been declining before the increase in these introduced species. So there was a study in Missouri, done in Missouri, I think it was in 2016, where they went back and looked at some of the historical records, and populations were definitely lower than they were previously, but they had already started the decline before things like the multicolored Asian lady beetle were introduced in the 80s and stuff. There had already been kind of a steady, slow decline before some of these introduced species started showing up. So introduced species certainly are not helping anything, but some of the studies have that have looked at this have shown that there was already some decline before they happened. Now, introduced species may have sped that up, but it was happening, at least in some species. We're already starting to see some of those declines. So, like a lot of things like bee species or monarch butterflies and a lot of these other insects, there's a lot of different factors that go into this to decline. So again, obviously the competition from introduced lady beetles, these introduced species typically are much larger or larger than our native species. So they're going to consume more. They will consume the eggs of our native species and the larvae of the native species as well. Change in land use and cropping patterns. This could be one of the reasons why we were starting to see a decline before these introduced species. Um, hedgerows being taken out in farm fields where these beetles would have been potentially living, food sources in those hedgerows, things like that. Increased use of pesticides, killing off all of their food and potentially killing the lady beetles themselves. Parasitism, whether that's disease or other insects parasitizing them as well. Changing climate, that's probably having some impact as well as things get warmer and wetter or drier depending on where in the country you're at. That will probably continue to have an effect on populations, not only of lady beetles, but other species as well. So some ways we can conserve lady beetles in our landscape. So, you know, like everything else, they need food, they need shelter, they need water. So they need to have prey, providing them with those supplemental food sources. Again, those shelters. So not only in-season refuges, but also overwintering sites, areas they can spend the winter. Main thing is habitat. The best thing we can do for lady beetles, and you can extend this to pollinators as well, is providing habitat for them. So for habitat, we can create or enhance habitat in peripheral areas of our landscapes. So, depending on where you live, if you're out in the country, field edges, fence rows, road edges. If you have some of that non-functional turf, that areas of your yard where basically all you do is cut it, you don't really use it for any recreation or anything else, convert some of that to landscape or to habitat for lady beetles, pollinators, what have you. Um, and if you have concerns with neighbors or maybe the city, obviously check your local ordinances. But a lot of times, if you mow a strip around these quote unquote natural areas, it makes it look more intentional, like a garden bed. And a lot of times, you don't get as many complaints. So the picture on the bottom there, this is Prairie Crossing subdivision in Grays Lake, Illinois. What they've done, they've just mowed a strip around this native planting, and it looks much more intentional than if it was going all the way up to the driveway or all the way up to the road. So we want to choose heavy pollen and nectar producing plants. Like I mentioned, several of these lady beetles will supplement their diet with pollen. It'll also attract other insects that they will potentially feed on as well. We want that season long bloom for our plants, planting in clumps rather than single plants. Clumps are going to be more attractive than individual plants. And the more flowers we have, the more beneficial insects we have, whether that be pollinators, predators like lady beetles, what have you. So when we talk about season-long bloom time, we want that from March, ideally March into October. Typically, when you think about landscapes, we do a pretty good job of that May to August, maybe September time frame. But on the shoulders there, March, April, late September, October, a lot of times we don't have a whole lot blooming in many of our landscapes, and those are going to be some important times. We've got things emerging early in the year, like that pink spotted lady beetle that can come out fairly early in the year before aphid populations have built up. So they're feeding on pollen to keep themselves going until their prey population starts showing up. And then in the fall, again, as things are getting ready to overwinter, having a food source available for them. A lot of our beneficial insects, will do kind of the broad picture of beneficial insects, which is going to include lady beetles. Again, they need that pollen and nectar to live and reproduce. Not necessarily lady beetles to reproduce, but to sustain themselves when they don't have food available. A lot of times they're going to like plants that produce small open flowers that have exposed nectaries. A lot of these insects are going to have small mouth parts. So plants in the carrot, aster, spurge, or pea or bean families are often attractive to them. Plants like dill, coriander, alyssum are also very attractive to lady beetles, as some examples there. So if you have some of these, a lot of our herbs are very attractive to these types of insects. Typically, we don't want them to flower if we're harvesting that because the oils get less concentrated. You don't get as much flavor, but maybe leave a couple plants, let them flower, and they can serve as a food source for lady beetles and other natural enemies. A lot of times we talk about native plants, and native plants are a lot of times are a very good option, or maybe even the best option. But how do you define native plants? So kind of the typical definition is plants recorded as growing wild in an area at the time that scientific collection began. So what does that mean to you? Is it native to North America or United States? For some people, that's good enough. Some people want things that are native to Illinois. Some people want them native to their the ecotype that's native to their area. So there can be a little bit of variation depending on the individual as to what native, how strict they want to be about what native is. And just because it's a native plant does not mean it's going to necessarily be a good garden plant. There are A lot of native plants that can be incredibly aggressive. Some of the goldenrods, if you plant those or common milkweed, they will quickly take over your landscape if you do not keep them contained. Does not necessarily mean they're going to have fewer disease and pest problems. Out in nature, we tend to overlook this stuff, but when it's right by our front door, we are going to notice the leaf spots and all the other damage that's being caused to these plants. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to grow better. Yes, they are adapted to our climate, but when we think about our typical urban and suburban landscapes, when houses are built, what do? They scrape off that topsoil, and a lot of times you're planting in to subsoil or a mix of subsoil and topsoil. So they have not really adapted to soils in a lot of our suburban urban areas. And native plants are not necessarily more desirable in the landscape than non-native plants. So if for here, so say you're going for a hike, you see this little flower here, you've got all kinds of bees all over. Maybe that's something you want to put in your landscape. That's poison ivy. Poison ivy is a native plant, but I don't know of anybody that wants poison ivy in their landscape. Admittedly, a bit of an extreme example, but just because it's native does not necessarily mean it's something you want in your landscape. So native plants benefits, obviously, they enhance that native biodiversity. They're from here. They can help us recreate habitats, what they used to look like potentially. Again, they're adapted to our local climates. And these are at least most of the ones that you're going to buy in landscape trade, is these are perennials. So they're going to be around for years and years to come. Some of the disadvantages, a lot of times they're going to cost more than non-native species, although the price has been coming down quite a bit the last several years as more and more people are interested in planting native plants. And they can take a little bit longer to establish, depending on if you're planting from seed or plugs. If you're planting seed, sometimes it can take 2 or 3 years before those plants start flowering. And depending on where you live, sourcing native plants can potentially be difficult as well. Non-native plants, there are some benefits to planting these. So you have reliable seed and plant sources. These have been grown for a long time in the landscape trade. They're very easy to find. A lot of them have prolific floral displays. Again, we're planting them because they produce a lot of flowers. A lot of times they are annuals, so they're producing a lot of flowers. And they've been grown all over the place for a long period of time. So we can kind of count on them having success in a lot of different areas. Disadvantages, again, they're not native, so they're not enhancing that native biodiversity. And they can become potentially invasive or problematic and outcompete our native species as well. So some more garden tips here. Again, we want to provide a habitat for overwintering. So brush piles. If you have a dead tree and it's not posing a risk to people or property, maybe leave that dead tree snag. Things will overwinter there under the bark and stuff like that. So providing that habitat for lady beetles and other insects to overwinter in. Again, just makes your landscape that much more attractive. And if they're there overwintering, they're going to come into your landscape that much quicker in the spring because they're already there. Grasses and sedges. Again, just including these in your landscape can help enhance the design and enhance that biodiversity. There's going to be different insects feeding on these, again, potential food sources for your beneficial insects as well. Some of these native grasses that do well in more of a landscape setting, these smaller bunch grasses. So prairie dropseed, that's on the left there. Side oats grama is in the middle, and the little blue stem on the right. They're smaller, 3 to 5 feet tallest for like little blue stem. But they're bunch grasses. So they're not quite as aggressive as some of the other species, and they stay smaller. And again, so when it comes to a few more garden tips here, we want to be willing to accept plant damage. We're talking about lady beetles here. You've got to have those aphids. You got to leave those aphids if you want those lady beetles to stick around. That's their food source. On milkweed, often get calls from people asking, what can I do to get these aphids off of my milkweed? I don't want them eating the plants and because they're growing them for monarchs and stuff. Well, if you leave those, more than likely lady beetles, maybe lacewings, things are going to come in and clean those up eventually. And they're not typically doing too much damage to those plants. Again, following IPM practices, So we don't necessarily want to reach for those pesticides right off the bat. There's a lot of ways we can manage pests, including natural enemies like lady beetles. So we don't necessarily want to use pesticides as the first way we are controlling pests in our landscapes. Again, watch your garden, keep a journal. Are there plants that you're always seeing lady beetles on, or always seeing aphids and stuff like that? Kind of get an idea of what's going on in your landscape. Um, and if you're interested, there are community science projects out there. So Lost Ladybug Project, I think that is out of Cornell University, if I remember right. For that one, you can take pictures and submit that to them and kind of help them map and track lady beetle populations um, across the U.S. And they've got some species that they are particularly interested in and trying to find those and document them to see if they still exist in different parts of the country. So if that's of interest, check that out, lostladybug.org, and see how you can get involved in that. And with that, like Jamie mentioned earlier, this is recorded and eventually will be up on our University of Illinois Extension Horticulture YouTube page, and you can find other our past 4 seasons recordings on there as well. We do have a brief survey that we would like you to fill out. Shouldn't take you too terribly long. You can scan that QR code or go to go.illinois.edu/ladybeetles2024 and fill that out. You can critique the presentation, tell us what you'd like to see for future presentations. Say we do read that stuff and plan accordingly based off of that.